With Christmas fast approaching, I've come up with some great ideas for you to use on your cakes. Today I'm going to show you how to make this entire festive scene, complete with Postbox and Robin and slightly tipsy Santa. If you don't want to be quite so adventurous, you could just do the Postbox on its own. These would make great gifts if you boxed them up and gave them to friends and family. My name's Abby and let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is cover our board. Now I've got a rectangular board here, it's about 12 by 14 inches, and I've got a kilo of white sugar paste. I've also got this texture sheet which is called Bubbles, but it's great for that sort of snowy sort of texture. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. First of all, I'm just going to damp my board with a little bit of water. That's cooled boiled water that I've just dipped in the end of a tissue, just so that it gives the icing something to stick to. Move that to one side. It's my very noisy icing sugar shaker. So I've dusted my surface with some icing sugar and I'm going to roll my sugar paste out now. So keep turning it as you roll so that it doesn't stick to your board. You're aiming to get this just a bit bigger than your cake board. But you want to make sure those corners are going to be covered. Okay. Just going to flip that over onto my rolling pin so that I can lift it easily. And I'm going to bring in my board. Lay your sugar paste onto it. You might need to just roll it out so it covers those little tiny edges. Now I've not rolled this out too thin because we are going to put the texture sheet onto it in a moment, and you want to be able to have enough so that it gets a nice good print. Okay. I'm going to give it a bit of a smooth out just to make sure there's no big lumps and bumps underneath it. Lovely. Then I've got this sheet here. Now I'm going to lay it on one side and then I'm going to do the other because it's not quite big enough for the whole board. So I'm just going to lay that on top there. And I'm going to use my smoother and I'm just going to rub. Okay, and then you should be able to peel that off and you have that lovely texture on there. And spin that round. I've left the edges on my icing at the moment because I'm going to trim those off once I've put the texture on. Okay, line that one up the other side. Brilliant. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is trim the edges off of my icing. So I'm going to do that with a palette knife and I'm just going to run it around the edge of the board. You want to sort of pull it along and pull it down so it gives you a nice clean edge. Spin it around. Okay, I'm just going to run my finger around the edge just to remove any rough edges because we want this nice and smooth and soft. Okay, there you have it. That's your iced board with your snowy texture. Now we can move on to making some of our cakes. Right, now for the Postbox, we're going to cover it in marzipan first. I'm using a fruit cake here because it's much easier to make this little cake with a solid piece of cake, and fruit cake is nice and dense. So I've baked this in a baked bean can, so it's sort of about 3 inches tall. And I'm going to cover it with some marzipan first, but to do so, we're going to need to brush it with a little bit of apricot jam or gel. And I've just got that in a bowl here. I'm just going to pop a little bit on this board, which we're going to place underneath. And we're going to leave that to one side. And this acts as something for the marzipan to stick to. So I'm actually going to brush it onto my cake. You can use cooled boiled water, but I think the apricot jam is a lot stickier. It's a lot nicer to use. So I'm going to brush that all up the sides of my cake. And on the top. Okay, and then we'll move that to the side for a minute and we'll come back to that in a moment. So I'm going to roll the marzipan now. As you can see, I've got about 500 grams of marzipan here, and I've taken a small amount off so that we can cut a disc to cover the top, because I'm actually going to roll it out and we're going to roll our cake in it, because it's so much easier with these little cakes than trying to cover them all in one go. So I'm going to dust my surface with a little bit of icing sugar. And I'm going to roll out my long piece. Now remember, it's quite a small cake, so you don't need this overly thick. Otherwise, when you cut into it, it will just be all icing and marzipan. Okay, so you just got to make sure that it's going to be wide enough to roll your cake in and long enough to go all the way around. Just going to trim the edges with a little bit with my palette knife here, just to give them a nice neat edge. And along the bottom. Okay, make sure you can move that around. Right, and I'm going to lie my cake so that it matches up with the bottom. Just going to trim that edge so that it's nice and neat too. So you've got a nice neat line to start with. And then what you want to do is find the top of your cake and trim all the way along so that piece is going to be exactly the same height as your cake. So we can take all that excess off. And what you want to do is lift it and roll it round. Just press it to the cake as you go. And then when you get to the other side, you should be able to match that up, trim the end off. And then what you can do is just neaten that up. So your marzipan is on your cake nice and smooth. And then what we're going to do is we're going to roll this piece out and we're going to cut it out into a disc that matches our cake. I'm actually going to use the base of my cake as my template here. You can use a cutter if you wish, but you should just be able to trim around that. And that piece will just fit on top nicely. You just want to make sure it's nice and even around the edge, nice and smooth. And then what we can do is we can put our icing over the top of it. Just going to give it a smooth with my smoother. Oh, board's popping out, that's it. Trim off any excess if you get any. Okay, and I'm going to pop that to one side now. And we're going to start working on our icing. So I've got 500 grams of red sugar paste here now. And I'm going to dust my surface with some more icing sugar. Right. Just going to roll it slightly into a sausage shape because it makes it much easier when you come to roll it. I'm not going to split this one into two pieces because we're not going to put a piece on the top. I'm just going to roll it out into a nice long strip. Now, because your icing is softer than the marzipan, you will need it ever so slightly thicker just to hold its shape. sure I can lift that off the board still. Again, I'm going to trim one edge nice and neat down the bottom. Remove that. And we're going to have one nice long neat edge down the side. And I'm actually going to flip this over because I want the nice icing on the outside as it is. I've turned that over the wrong way. Let's trim that edge nice and neat, because you want that nice shiny smooth sugar paste on the outside, and we're going to roll this up. And if you did it the other way round, you'd end up with all these sort of patchy bits on the outside. Okay, so I'm going to bring my cake in again, and I'm going to cover it up in a bit more apricot jam. Not too much, just enough so that this icing will stick. Okay, right, so I'm going to take my cake and, just as we did before, line it up with the bottom edge, and then we're going to trim the top edge off so that it matches, so it meets up nicely. We're going to move that bit out of the way, and then we're going to roll. And again, trim off that edge where the sugar paste meets. A bit too much there. Okay, and just press that together. And then what you can do is stand it up on its end. And using your smoother and your hand, we're just going to work at this line here. The heat from your palm of your hand is brilliant for this because it manipulates the sugar paste brilliantly. And it'll just get rid of that little line so that we can't see it anymore. Don't worry too much if you can't get rid of that line, because it's going to be at the back of the cake, so it won't be obvious on the cake. And then we're just going to rub all the way around your cake, nice and smooth. And the great thing about this being made out of fruitcake, obviously, is it is nice and firm, so it's not going to crumble or crunch if you put a bit of pressure on it. Okay, and then you want to pop that to the side, and shortly we're going to start working on the top for our postbox. Okay, so I'm going to start now by doing these little pieces on the front of my postbox, the little letterbox and the little collection times sheet. I'm going to start with that because it's white. If I do it after the red, my hands are going to get really sticky. So I'm going to start with this. A little bit of corn flour on my board, and I'm just going to roll this tiny piece of white sugar paste out. You don't need very much at all, about a pea-sized amount really. I'm just going to dust that a bit. Okay, and I'm going to cut this out freehand, but I'm going to use a craft knife, so do be very careful if you use one of these because they are incredibly sharp. And we're just going to cut a little square. Actually, that's a lie. We're going to cut a rectangle. So I'm just going to do that freehand. You probably want it no longer than the length of the blade that you're cutting with here. So, just sort of make sure the edges are nice and straight and neat. If you do find that it's a little bit big later, you can always trim it down further. Right, so that's that one. I'm going to move that to the side. And now I'm going to do the little black letterbox. Same process again, just going to roll it out on my surface. But this one you want longer and thinner. We're going to make a really long sort of letterbox shape. So you probably want this piece about sort of a blade and a half long. Try and make sure those lines are nice and straight. Okay. Lovely, and pop that one to the side. I'm going to make the little pieces to go behind them now, so I'm just going to take a very small piece of red sugar paste. I'm going to roll that out. Okay, so you want to be able to fit these two pieces on top of these and with a little red border around the edge. So I'm going to take a little bit of edible glue and I'm just going to pop it straight onto my paste here. And I'm going to place my little white square on top, rectangle I should say. Just like that. And then I'm going to trim round it with my knife just slightly wider than the white, so you've got a nice little red border. Just like so. That's one. I'm going to do the same with my black letterbox. Let's pop a little stripe of glue on there. Make sure that's nice and neat around the edges. And lay that on. And again, cut around the edge. Okay, and I'm just going to make sure those edges are nice and straight on there. Okay, so I'm going to leave those to the side for a moment and we're going to focus on the actual postbox now. So I'm going to run a little red strip around the top here. So I'm going to take a piece of sugar paste to do that. I'm going to move my bit of cling film over for a moment. We'll come back to that later. So I'm going to roll this out into a sausage. Dust my surface. And you want to roll this out so that it's going to be long enough to wrap around your cake, a bit like we did with our sugar paste when we covered the postbox. Okay, you want this sort of fairly thin. Don't roll it out paper thin though, because if you then try and move it around, you'll end up breaking it. Right. So I'm just going to use a cutting wheel here, and I'm going to cut a nice long strip. Got squeaky wheels. All the way down. And you want this probably about, I'd say about 1/2 centimetre wide. It's just to go around that top edge, neaten it up slightly. Okay. Trim the ends off. More than I need there. I'm going to bring my cake in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a little bit of glue all the way around this top edge here. Okay. And I'm going to start from the back where that little seam was that we tried to work out earlier, so that you've got a back to your cake. And I'm going to run this strip all the way around that top edge so that it sits nice and level with the sugar paste that you've put on your cake. Then when you get to the end, use your craft knife very carefully to trim that. And then just press it in. So that's a nice rim around the top of that cake now. So the next thing to do is I'm going to make this top piece of the post box. And as you can see, it's kind of got like a rounded sort of edge, like a soft edge to it. And the trick with that is to use a piece of cling film. So I'm going to roll this out, sort of fairly thickly. You don't want this piece too thin, so roll it out so you've got a nice piece. So a good sort of centimetre or so thick. Lay your cling film over the top of your icing. Sort of smooth it out nicely. Don't press it down too much, but make sure it's nice and sort of smooth. And then I've got a large cutter here. This is a 98mm cutter. It's a large round one. And I'm going to use the smooth side of this cutter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to push down, and as you push down, that cling film will grip the sugar paste and it will sort of pull it in nice and tight and give you that really nice smooth finish. So, fingers crossed, if we take that off, remove all that from the edge, you should have this nice piece of flat sugar paste which has got this lovely rounded edge to it. Now here I've got a little single thick cardboard, and this is a 3.5 inch one. And what I'm going to do is put a bit of glue on it, and this is going to sit underneath this piece of sugar paste to make it nice and firm so that it doesn't start to droop. Line that up and get it nice and over the top. Make sure you kind of get it in the middle, because what you're going to do is you're just going to press down so that that nice round edge goes over the top and sits flush. So you're kind of almost pushing the board into it. Push that edge round that board, lovely. Nice and smooth. Okay. So the idea is that you can't really see that little silver board we've put underneath there when you put it on top of your cake. Okay. Once you're happy with that and you've smoothed it out, we're going to pop some glue on the top of our cake, all the way around that edge, a little bit in the middle. You could use your apricot jam for this if you've got any left. And we're going to place that on top. You want to make it nice and central. Okay. So that it's got this little lip, so it just overhangs the top of your cake. And then I'm going to take a paintbrush, and I'm going to use the end. You can use a cake dowel if you like. And I'm just going to push in and make little dents all the way around my post box, sort of in about sort of centimetre spaces apart. All the way around that top edge. Okay. And then I'm going to take my cutting wheel and I'm going to make another mark in between, this time a slightly thinner, sort of deeper mark. Okay. Lovely. Okay, so you want to find the front of your cake now. And this is where these little pieces come in. We're going to attach these to the front. Now, your letterbox is going to sit right at the top, just underneath that little lip, and then the other piece is going to sit just below it. Make sure I've got the middle of my cake. So you want a little bit along the top there. And then glue that to your cake. Lovely. And then a bit more just underneath. Just slightly below that. Lovely. Okay. And once that's dry, what we'll do is we'll just write some little squiggly lines on there to make it look like it's got the writing on it. But you need to do that when it's completely dry, otherwise you'll make a big hole in it with your pen. Right, I'm going to paint on the little gold royal cipher and crown now, and to do that I'm using this Roll Chem gold dust, which I'm going to turn into a paint using this Rejuvenator Spirit here. So I just want to mix that up. Okay, so you want a really fine paintbrush to do this. And we're just going to do it so we kind of give the impression of the crown. So I'm going to start by painting a little line here for the base of the crown. And I'm going to paint a line straight down the middle. And then I'm going to sort of do like a heart shape coming from either side. So you've got one side of the heart here. And then the other side here. And there. Okay. Now I'm going to paint the ER2 underneath here. So it's got the little 2 in the middle. I'm going to start with that. So it's 2 little lines. There you go. So that's your logo. I'm going to move my paints out the way, and I'm going to do this little black strip at the bottom. So as you can see here, I've got some black sugar paste, which I'm just going to roll out into a bit of a sausage. And we're going to do a bit like we did for the strip on the top. We're going to roll a long piece. Let's move that over slightly. You want this piece sort of not too thin. It's supposed to look a little bit chunky on the bottom. Okay. And I'm going to use my cutting wheel again, just to cut a nice long strip. And now depending on how much room you've got left on the bottom will depend on how thick you can do this. So you want it sort of not, so it comes right up to the bottom of that little painting we've just done. So I'm going to do mine about 1.5 centimeters thick, wide I should say. And we're just going to cut that all the way along. Squeak, squeak. Then move that out of the way. Brush a bit of glue around the base of your cake. And again, start at the back like we did before. And then just run that all the way around the edge. Oh, that was a bit perfect, wasn't it? Okay. Just smooth it in so that this top edge is nice and flush against the cake. Brilliant. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a slightly larger wheel now. This is off of a designer wheel, so it's got 3 different wheels to it, and I'm using the little straight sort of wide one here, and I'm going to run a line all the way around, sort of about 2/3 of the way up that black strip, all the way around. Like so. And then I'm going to take my thinner wheel that we were using earlier, the cutting wheel, and I'm going to run one between the top and that line that we've just created. Careful with this one because it's a little bit thinner, and this wheel is designed for cutting sugar paste, so it's a little bit sharper. All the way around. Brilliant. Just like that. Okay, so now that we've made all of our postbox, the last thing to do is just add that little bit of writing. So I'm just going to do little squiggly lines on here, just to make it look, give the impression of the writing for the collection times. Just like that. Okay, now that's your postbox nice and finished. The next thing I'm going to move on to doing is making the little robin to go on top. So now I'm going to show you how to make this cute little robin that sits on top of our postbox. The first thing I've done is I've rolled out a small piece of red and a small piece of white sugar paste, and I've rolled them out nice and thin. And I'm going to use a little round cutter here, about the size of a 10p piece, to cut out 2 discs, one in the red and then one in the white. And I'm also going to cut a very thin strip of white sugar paste out, which will run round the top of our robin's, the bottom of our robin's hat in a moment. So you just want a really thin, only sort of a few millimetres thick, for the trim of his hat. I'm going to move that piece to the side for a moment. Now with these circles, I'm going to leave the red one as it is, but the white one I'm going to trim down, and I'm going to use the cutter that we were using to cut the full circle out with, and I'm going to kind of cut about 2/3 of the way up, so you get kind of this sort of like eye shape here. What we're going to do is we're going to glue that to one end of this red circle, just like that. Okay, so now for our robin's body, I'm using some dark brown sugar paste here. I'm going to roll this into a nice ball. We're going to make a nice little fat robin. Okay, so he's got a nice little round body. And we're going to attach that little piece of sugar paste that we've just cut out, those little circles, to the front. You want it so that it sits just on the front of his body, and it just sort of tucks underneath him. More glue on that bit. Okay, like so. And then pop him to one side to dry and firm up a bit. And I'm going to make his little wings now and his tail. To do that, I'm just going to take a piece of that brown sugar paste and roll it into a ball, about a pea-sized amount. And I'm going to squish it between my finger and thumb, and I'm just going to pinch it so that it's kind of tapered at one end. So it's kind of like a long, sort of ovally shape, almost a bit like a comma, because we're going to bend that top edge up. I'm going to flatten the end out. So it kind of looks like a little comma or an apostrophe. And then on the wide end, I'm just going, the thin end, sorry. I'm going to make 3 little marks that kind of feathers it out and makes it look a little bit like a wing. So we're going to do 2 of those. Again, squish it down on one end, thin it out. Now this one you want to bend up so that it sits the opposite way, because they're going to sit on either side of our robin's body. So flatten it out and pinch this one upwards. And then with your cutting wheel, cut in. So you have 2 little wings. Lovely. And those are just going to be attached to either side of our robin's body. Sort of halfway up. You want the feathered bit at the back. And just push them in place. Okay. And then we're going to make a tail piece in a very similar way. This piece is going to be a little bit smaller. You want to roll it into a ball and push it flat and pinch one end. But this time we're going to make the marks on the wide end, so it kind of looks a little bit like a fan. Like that. Okay, and we're going to glue that to the back of our robin. And if you bend this piece so that the thin end that we haven't marked sits at a little bit of a curve, you can press that on to your model and that will sit up nicely. Okay. Now to work on his face, I've got 2 little pieces of sugar paste here. I've got one in orange, which I'm just going to pinch a little piece off of and roll it into a ball. And then I'm going to roll it into a little cone shape. So it looks like his beak. Like that. And we're going to glue that so that it sits just at the top of that little red breast. There we go. Just on there. And then for the eyes, we're going to use the black. So we want 2 very tiny pieces. Just rolled into balls on there. One there, make sure they're roughly the same size. And then they're going to sit on his face, just either side of his nose, just above it, his beak, sorry. And just push them in slightly. Okay. And there's your little robin. So the next thing to do is finish him off by making his hat. So to do that, I'm going to use some red sugar paste, which I'm going to roll in my hand. Okay, that's better. Bend the tip of that over. And we're going to glue that to the top of his head. So just push it in place. Okay. And with that little white strip that we cut out earlier, run a little bit of glue around the base of your hat. Start at the back and run that piece all the way around. Finishes his hat off nicely. I'm going to use my craft knife just to give that a nice neat cut and finish. Okay. And I'm going to take a little ball of white, not very much. Just a little tiny piece. And we're going to glue that just to that little pointed end of his hat. Push that on. Because it's a nice tiny piece of sugar paste, it's quite nice and light, so it should hold its shape and it should keep in position. And there's your little Christmas robin. Next up, I'm going to show you how to make this Santa model, who, if you ask me, looks like he's had one tipple too many. We're going to start by making the legs and body of our Santa first. I've got some red sugar paste here, which I have added some sugar cell to, which will turn it into a modelling paste. we want this to dry nice and firm. So I've done that to all of my colours that I'm using here. And it's roughly a level teaspoon per 250 grams of paste. So I'm going to take about just under half of my red here. And I'm going to roll it round. We want a nice and smooth piece of paste. You want to get rid of any of those creases or cracks in that. Okay. I'm going to take my smoother and I'm just going to push the top of it nice and flat and smooth the sides down. And what we're looking for is kind of a rectangular shape. But you want this nice and smooth and push it sort of so it's got a flat top to it, a nice neat end. It's a bit of trial and error this, just sort of work it until you feel that you're comfortable and you're happy with the shape of it. I'm just going to dust my surface with a bit of corn flour. Okay, and I'm going to take my rolling pin and I'm just going to push down on one end so that it's nice and flat. And that's where our body is going to sit in a moment. So you want to make that nice and flat, but you want that line there to be nice and straight as best you can so that the body sits evenly in there. And then I'm going to take a few of my tools. I've got my designer wheel here and I'm going to run a line all the way down the centre like so, and you want that sort of quite sort of deeply indented there, because that's going to form the sort of the bit between our two legs. So that sort of shows where they're separating. And then I'm going to take my blade tool here and I'm just going to make lots of marks all across these sort of the trouser legs. I'm going to do a little sort of V shape at the top here. And just some little, kind of look like creases in his trousers. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to trim this end nice and flat. So that's his legs. You can just do a few marks coming up from the bottom of those as well. Okay, and you want to pop that to one side and leave that to dry. I'm going to split the remaining sugar paste into two. And I'm going to make his body now. So I'm going to roll this again like we did before into a ball until it's nice and smooth. Okay, lovely. And this time I'm actually going to roll it into a cone. So I'm going to put my piece of paste on the board and I'm going to roll it with my hands sort of tilted like a triangle until I've got a bit of a cone shape, and I'm going to lay it flat, just press it down slightly. So you want this to be sort of flat on one side and slightly rounded on the other. And you also want to make sure that it fits nicely in that piece of sugar paste that we pressed flat. So it needs to sit nicely and be roughly the same size as that piece there on the base. Just flatten the top off so that you can pop your head on later and it sits nice and flat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to push slightly on the top so that the top of his chest area sits further in than his belly, basically. So we're going to have a nice round belly. Okay, I'm just going to make sure that sits in there. Lovely, so you should just be able to sit that in like so. I'm going to leave that to dry for a minute. But before I do that, I'm just going to make a mark like we did with his trousers, right down the front. Not so deep this time, but it's just a little guideline so that we can tell where the centre of his jacket will sit later. Now for his arms, I'm going to roll out a piece of sugar paste. It's always handy to have your model nearby so you can kind of compare how big things need to be. So he's quite a chunky model. Let's have one too many mince pies. And I'm just going to use a crafts knife for this, and I'm going to cut a diagonal line. Once I've got my arms to the right size, you want one end ever so slightly thinner than the other, so the top half of his arm should be wider than the bottom. So that narrow end I'm going to cut flat, and at the other end here I'm going to cut a diagonal. Turn that around to this way. So you've got quite a fine bit at the top, because that will sit really nicely on the side of his shoulder in a moment then. Also, where that cut I've just made is, I'm going to turn my piece of sugar paste up so that's facing me, and I'm going to cut a little V shape about halfway down his arm, and I'm actually going to take a little chunk of that paste out, because I find that then you can bend his arm nice and evenly without any cracks appearing on your paste. So I'm going to do as we did before, and I'm going to use little marks to look like the creases in his jackets and jumpers. There we go. And I'm going to make 2 of those, one for either side of his body. In terms of size, you want to try and make sure they're the same. Okay, so I'm going to trim down one end. And then you want to make sure this one sits the opposite way. So if this one is going to sit on this side of his body, you want to make sure that this one sits on this side, so cut the opposite way. Just like that. And again, cut that little V out. And bend that one in. And some little creases. Okay. And we're going to pop those to one side to dry, and we'll pop them on once they've firmed up a little bit, but they're not completely dry. We'll put them on so that we can still move them about a bit. So I'm going to start assembling his body now. I've got here a cake pop stick, which I've cut down so that it's going to sit just above his body into his head. So to attach those, I'm going to use a bit of glue. Just a little bit of glue on there. Not too much, otherwise it becomes all slippery and it moves around and starts to ooze a bit. Place the body on, like so. Push it on nicely, and then I'm going to put this cake pop stick right the way through the centre of his body, and that will keep him nice and upright. Okay, and we're going to move that to the side. Okay, so I've got some little balls here that I've rolled out already, and these are going to go on his feet and on the ends of his arms. I'm actually just going to give this a quick wipe down, because otherwise you get red icing, it gets everywhere. Right. Okay. I'm going to dust my surface with a bit of corn flour, and I've just rolled these balls out ready, and I'm just going to flatten them with my thumb. That's it. And then the same again with the smaller ones. And these are going to make the white sort of cuffs of his sleeve and his trousers. I'm going to pop a little bit of glue on the end of our legs. And the large ones are going to sit on the ends there. Sort of push them on. Lovely. And then these smaller ones are just going to go on the ends of his sleeves. That's one on each arm. Okay. And now that those arms have had a little time to dry, I'm going to attach them to his body. So I'm going to just push that in slightly. Bit of glue on each side. You want enough glue so that it sticks, but not so much glue, otherwise it'll start to slide. And then what we're going to do is we're going to attach the arms to the side of the body Just push them in place. Let's pop that one back on there. Because they're still sort of slightly soft, we can move them around nicely. Give them a bit of a squish into place. This one will do. Just go over some of those marks if you've managed to move them out of the way. Okay, I'm going to set him to one side and I'm going to have a clear down now because I'm going to start to work on his white beard and his sort of flesh coloured face. So we want our hands to be nice and clean, otherwise you'll get red marks everywhere. So I'm going to have a clear down and I'll be back shortly. Now that we've cleaned down and it's nice and tidy, I'm going to do the trim around his jacket. I'm going to do this using white paste, which I'm going to roll out into a really long sausage. You want a very thin piece here, but you want it to run down his jacket, round his back and back up the front of his jacket. You can do this before you put the arms on it. It does make it a little bit easier. Okay. I'm going to put a bit of glue all the way down the front. And we're going to run a bit of glue right the way around. And this is going to hide this little bit here where you've got the join between his legs and his body. This will cover that seam up nicely. Okay, so I'm going to start at the top, push that in. I'm going to work our way around. I'm just going to lift his arms up. We're going to go all the way around. And back up the middle again. I'm just going to trim that off at the top. Okay, right. So now I'm going to move on to his head and then we'll do his beard. So for his head, I've got some paste that I have coloured with a peach colour paste colour. So I'm going to roll that into a ball. Now obviously depending on how big you've made your body, obviously you need to kind of think about how big your head needs to be. So I normally sort of roll a circle, just see how it looks, how it sits, whether you need to make it bigger or smaller. So you want to get rid of any cracks or creases in that. Lovely. Brilliant. Now, I'm just going to pinch the bottom of it ever so slightly. So it's almost oval shaped, but still quite round and soft. And then we're going to put this, I found my glue stick, onto the cake pop. Let's move that in a bit. Just push that down, like so. And if you do it while it's still soft, it gives you that ability to move it around a bit. Okay. Once you're happy with the position of your head, we can start working on our beard. For this, I'm using the white. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll a ball of white, and then I'm going to roll it into a cone. Make sure I've got some powder on my desk, and I'm going to flatten it. So I'm going to push it down, and you want to make this top bit quite wide, so sort of just pull it out a bit. But you also want to make this quite flat so that it's going to sit flush on his face. And then you sort of pull it out, tease it around, that's it. And I'm going to bend the bottom of it up, a bit like we did for the Robin's hat earlier. And we're just going to pull it up so it has this nice little curve. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my blade tool and I'm going to start to mark this just with lots of little lines. You want to come in from the edge. Like so, and then a few on that little end bit. Okay, like that. And we're also going to make two smaller pieces, almost like a big moustache. So for those, I'm going to take a little ball, probably about a pea-sized amount, and I'm going to roll it into a ball, and I'm going to roll it into a cone again. But this time you want to make that end very thin. And we're going to flatten it ever so slightly. You don't want to make it as flat as the piece on the bottom, but just so that the top of it is sort of soft. And we're going to roll that end up so it curves round like that. We're going to do another one of those. I want to do two of them. One that's going to sit either side of his beard. Again, roll it into a little tiny cone. And twist the end up. I want to make sure about the same size. Okay. And we're going to mark these like we did the bigger piece. Sort of using a rolling motion with this, so it's coming in to the middle. That's it. And these are going to sit on top of this piece here, on his face. So I'm going to glue this bit to his face now. Find my glue brush. There we go. And it needs to sit sort of about halfway up. I want to pop a little bit of glue on his chest area. I'm just going to bring this in, and what you can do is just sort of start to play around. I'm going to make that a bit shorter actually. I've made him a bit long. There we go. And we're going to push that. I've made my beard too big. Here we go. And that's going to sit on his face. Just like so. And then sort of push it in and around. Make sure it's nice and stuck. That's it. And you can go over some of your marks if you lose them. Okay. And then we're going to attach those two smaller pieces just here. So make sure you've got a bit of glue on it. And do this around this way. One just there. And the other there. And they should meet in the middle, those two. You want them just sitting there. Okay, and I'm going to use a little bit of leftover peach colour now to make his nose. So I'm just going to roll a circle, a little ball. And I'm going to put that just, a little bit of glue, just in the middle of those two pieces of his beard that meet. Just there. He's got a nice little round nose. And I'm going to use the end of a paintbrush here to make a little hole just below where his beard sits on his face. And we're going to use a very, very small piece of black paste rolled into a ball, like minute, really tiny. And I'm going to pick it up with, I'm going to put a little bit of glue in that hole, and then I'm going to pick it up with my glue brush, hopefully, yes. I'm going to pop it on there, and then using the paintbrush that you just made the hole with, if you push, it makes a little tiny mouth. Okay. I've also got two tiny, tiny balls here of black, which I'm going to use for his eyes. And you want those to sit just above the nose, sort of either side of it. A bit of glue on there. Just press those on. A bit more glue on that side. There we go. And I'm going to make two tiny little eyebrows now. I'm going to use the white for this. And these are really, really little. So I'm going to take a little tiny ball of white and I'm going to roll it into a sausage, and I'm going to taper it a bit like we did for these pieces here. But rather than twist them up, I'm just going to twist them into a curve. So you should have two little tiny, well, look like little tiny slugs to me. Here. You want the fat bit, the wide part of this, to be in the centre. Okay, and I'm going to take my craft knife and I'm just going to make some little marks in this one. If you use the bigger knife, it'll squish those completely. So I'm just going to use my craft knife just to give them a little bit of detail. Okay. Lovely, he's looking good. So now I'm going to move on to making his hat. For that I've got the red paste back again. Okay, so I'm going to roll it into a cone. You want to taper the end of this quite a lot because we're going to be able to fold it right over in a minute. If you work it on the board, that gives you a nice smooth flat edge. And then you can just mark some creases into this one where that would sort of bend over the top. And then a few more sort of around it. Okay. I'm going to put a bit of glue on the top of his head now. And I'm going to pop his hat on. I'm actually just going to work it and just sort of try and flatten it to his head slightly. That's it. I'm just going to go back over some of those marks we made. Lovely. Okay, so I'm going to add the trim to his hat now. To do that, I'm going to roll a really thin sausage, like we did for his jacket. I'm going to roll it out, obviously not quite as long this time. Okay. So I'm going to put a bit of glue all the way around his hat, just at the base. And I'm going to run my trim all the way around the bottom of that and use my craft knife to trim it off. Okay, lovely. And I'm just going to use my blade tool just to mark little lines all the way around that. Make it look like a fluffy trim. Lovely. And then we need to add a little ball to the end of his hat. So for that I've just got a ball of white paste, which I'm going to pop on the end here. Actually, I'm going to make that a bit bigger. Lovely. I'm going to take the end of my paintbrush for this, and I'm just going to make a little dent, and then I'm going to pop a bit of glue on there. And I'm going to push that one onto the end of his hat. And then I'm going to take my blade tool and make a few marks on there. Lovely. That's his hat done. Okay, I'm now going to start making some white bits for his hair to go around the side of his hat here. So as you can see, I've just started rolling some little balls of white, because at the moment he looks a bit bald. So I'm just rolling little circles, little balls of white, which we're going to stick all the way around the edge. So I'm going to pop a bit of glue just around the edge of his hat and just down onto his head. And I'm going to take a ball and push it on. And we're going to flatten them as you go. So sort of push it on and flatten it slightly. That's it. And then just mark them a little bit. Just adds a bit of texture to them. Lovely. And we're going to do this all the way around the back of his head. You only probably want about a row or 2 rows of these at the most. We're not covering the entire head. Okay, lovely. Now that Father Christmas has a face and a hat and a beard, we need to add his feet and his hands. So to do that, I'm going to take some of my black paste and I'm going to roll it into a ball. I'm going to start by making his feet. What you want to do is roll that, make a little bit more actually. Roll your ball and then roll it slightly into sort of a sausage, and we're going to pinch one end a little bit and flatten it out so that you end up with like a little foot shape, and that's going to sit on the end like this. So you're going to glue that on, one there and one here. That's one foot. Lovely. And another. Lovely. And just press those on Really simple. And we're going to use the same sort of technique for his hands. Smaller piece this time. But what we're going to do is we're going to pinch it like we did before and flatten it out slightly. But this one you want a little bit more round than you do long. And then we're going to take our craft knife and on the wide end, we're going to cut into it about halfway down and then just round those edges off so that he looks like he's got a mitten. We're going to do another one of those. Again, you want to try and make these the same size. So roll it, push it down. Now this one you want to make sure you cut the other way so that his thumbs are on the right side of his body. Like that. There we go. So he's got two little hands. We're going to glue those onto his hands. One there. And one there. Okay, I'm just going to pull this thumb outwards slightly because that's going to be the hand that will hold his glass of sherry later. So the final thing left to do on our Santa is just to do those little rosy cheeks. And to do that, I've got a little bit of dusky pink edible dust here. And I'm just going to use a very small amount. In fact, I'm just going to put it in the lid because it's not worth taking a paint palette out for this. And I've got a small paintbrush and I'm just going to put a little bit on the end and I'm just going to dust a tiny bit on his cheeks, sort of above where his moustache is. On both sides of his face. Just going to turn that round for a moment. And there you have it. That's your Santa. I'm going to make some of the smaller details to our Christmas scene now. So that's the letters over here, the mince pies. I've got this letter that Santa's holding in his hand, and I've got a sherry bottle down here. I'm also going to show you how to make the bricks for the wall. So I'm going to show you how to make these little envelopes first with the letters in. As you can see, I've got one completely made here. It just needs the writing on it. I've got one square cut out, which is just going to show you the envelope. And this one here, I'm going to show you how to make one of these open ones. As you can see, I've got like a little white sort of rectangle of paste. It's not quite square. I'm going to put that in the middle of my green paste here. And I'm going to use my cutting wheel just to mark around the edge. Like this. So you kind of just want to be able to see a mark of sort of 2/3 of your piece. And I'm going to turn it upside down where I've not put a mark. And I'm going to find sort of the middle point between those two lines, and I've put a mark up here so I know where I'm going, and I'm going to create the top of the envelope, so a triangle sort of downwards. So I'm going to do one that way and then one this way, and that will create the top of my envelope. So when I put this piece back on here, I'm actually going to sit it further up so you can just see that piece poking out underneath. And then I'm going to turn it sideways and I'm going to find the middle point again between these two lines, which is about here, and I'm going to make a triangle there. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. And then on the bottom I'm going to do the same again, but I'm going to make this one nice and long, so it comes down a bit lower. I'm we should be able to take that piece around it. So it's kind of like a kite shape. It's sort of slightly shorter on the top than it is the bottom. I'm going to put a bit of edible glue in here now. So pop some glue in there. And I'm going to put my triangle, my square that we cut out earlier, just in there. You want it just poking up over the top. And I'm going to glue half of that. And we're going to fold the sides in. I'm just going to pull that towards me for a second. So there's one. And there's the other. So that's two sides. And I'm going to trim a little bit off the bottom of that triangle so it's flat. Like so. And we're going to fold that bottom piece up as well. So if you can just see that there, I've created this nice little envelope. I'm just going to pinch the corners so that they sit together neatly. Okay, and once that's completely dry, what you can do is take your edible pen and write on that. So I'm just going to show you to do that on this one. So you can just write straight onto there once they're nice and dry. Like that. And then on this one here, I've cut out a little tiny square of white, which I'm going to use for our postage stamp. And that's going to glue just on the top corner. Push that down. And then I'm just going to do sort of a rough sort of line to make it look like the outside of the edge of the Queen's face. Doesn't have to be anything too exact. And I'm just going to put little dots all the way around the edge. Just to give it a bit of detail. And then you can also write on here, she says, very carefully. Lovely. That can sit to one side. The next thing I'm going to show you how to do is to make the mince pies. Now I've got one here that's already half made, so I'm going to show you how to finish this off. So what I've got is I've got a ball of sort of pale brown sugar paste, which I've rolled into a nice ball. And then I've used a ball tool just to push in the top. And what we're going to do is push in and work it round. So use both ends if you need, to create a sort of a well in the middle of that piece. And then I've just sort of rounded it off with my fingers, softened that edge off, like so. And I take my cutting wheel and I'm going to mark little lines all the way around the edge, like so. I've got a little bag here which has got some piping jelly in it, which I've coloured brown. So I'm going to use that to fill in the centres of my mince pies. So I'm just going to squeeze a little bit into the middle, like so. And on this one. And then I've got this star cutter here, which I've already cut one out of, so I'm just going to cut another. Push that out. And then I'm going to sit that just on top of my mince pie. There. So they're really easy. Quite little, but quite effective. Like so. Put those to one side. Okay, I'm going to show you how to make the bottle now. So I've got some green paste to make my bottle with, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. I've got a piece of sugar paste here which I've coloured up in cream. So I'm just going to make the label for my bottle because that needs to dry so that we can write on it. So I'm going to cut a rectangular shape, but I'm going to make one end of it pointed into a triangle. So we're going to cut down into a rectangle first. like so. That's it. And then I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to cut the corners off of one of them, one of the ends. Make sure it's nice and even. Okay, and that's your piece ready made for your label. So for our bottle, I've got some of this green paste here, which I'm going to give a good knead. Okay, so I'm going to roll it into a sausage, and then I'm going to roll and push my finger on it so that one of the ends starts to thin out. And then I'm going to stand it up on its end and I'm going to give it a wiggle so that it starts to become sort of bottle shaped. So you should have a nice even shape with a tapered cone at the top. And then I'm going to use my craft knife just to trim that end off nice and neatly, like so. There you go. So that's your bottle shape. So I'm going to add my label now. A little bit of glue on there. Put my label on my bottle. I'll do the writing on that in a moment. But I'm going to cut a little strip of black just to go over the top now. I'm going to use my cutting wheel. Okay, and I'm going to put a little bit of glue on this edge here. I'm going to just wrap my piece of black paste round the top, pressing it on and then trimming it off. I'm going to take my cutting wheel and I'm just going to put a mark, sort of one at the bottom edge and then one on the top edge. Like so. Give that a pinch. Right, now for the writing, I'm just going to use two edible pens. I'm going to use a black and a red. I'm going to use the wide end of the red and I'm just going to create a diamond sort of shape on the bottom. Just a little, I want to hold this still a bit. Colour that in. And then I'm going to use the fine end of my black pen to write my writing on. So I'm going to start in the, I always find it easier to start in the middle of my words, work one way and then turn it round and work back the other. That way you're not leaning your hand over anything you've already done. And that's your little sherry bottle done. That's ready to go on your board later. Now the final thing I'm going to show you how to do is to make these bricks for the wall. They're really, really simple. All I've got is some brown sugar paste here, which I've added CMC to make it into a modelling paste. And I'm going to roll it into a ball. And I'm going to squish it between my thumb and finger on either side, top and bottom, and then I'm going to turn my fingers and do the same on the end. So you sort of square off the sides. Nope. Just like that. And then what I'll do is I'll make several of those, and I can line them all up and stack them all up. So the next thing to do is we're ready to start assembling our cake on the board. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to put on my board is my post box. I'm going to bring that in gently. I'm going to pop a little bit of royal icing on my board to hold this in place. Just a little bit. Okay, and before I do anything else to this, I'm actually going to spray it with some edible glaze spray, just to give it that sort of shiny look. Lovely. And then I'm going to bring my Father Christmas in, my Santa Claus. So I'm going to pop him next to my post box. So again, a little bit of icing on my board. I'm going to sit him just there. Okay. I'm going to start putting some of the other pieces on my board now. I'm going to pop the sherry bottle on, and I'm going to pop that down next to Father Christmas. The same with the mince pies. I can pop those down around here. Okay, and the letters, they're going to sit on the front. So I'm just going to pop a little bit of icing here. There's one on the envelope. And then those there. Lovely. Now I'm going to use a bit of glue for this one because I don't want to end up with loads of royal icing on Santa's lap, but I'm just going to pop a little bit of glue on there, and I'm going to position the letter that we made, which I've now written on, as you can see with my edible pen. We're just going to rest that on the lap. And in this bag here, I've got some more piping jelly. This time I've dyed it burgundy to match the colour of the sherry. So I'm just going to trim the end off of this. And then that I'm going to pour as if it's coming out of the bottle that's laying down on the ground. Just give it a bit of a squeeze. And I've also got this little tiny plastic glass here, which I've already filled with some of my burgundy piping jelly, and I'm just going to rest that in Santa's hand like that, so it looks like it's pouring over the edge. And I'm going to pop a little drop below that on the board to look like it's dripping out of the glass. Let's move that to one side. Now I'm going to bring in my bricks, which are all here on this board, and I'm just going to start building my wall. And to do that, I'm just going to take a little bit of glue and run a line along here. It doesn't have to be a straight line, you can go for a curved line if you like. And I'm just going to start building up my bricks. I'm going to write a layer and a row all in one here, right to the edge of the board. And then I'm going to start building them upwards. So I'm going to pop a little bit of glue on top of those. And I'm going to bring them in. So I'm not going to put it quite on the same edge. So they're kind of going to overlap the bricks that we've already got, like you would see on a normal brick wall. Okay. And the same again. And I'm also going to pop a couple of loose bricks sort of just down here on the ground. Okay. Lovely. Now that I'm happy with my arrangement of my wall, I'm going to start adding the snow. So to do that, I've got my bag of royal icing here. I'm just going to trim the end off, widen it out. First of all, I'm going to put a patch on the top of my post box so that we can attach our robin. And I'm going to put him on this side. So I'm just going to squeeze a big old bit of royal icing onto here. Lovely. And we're going to sit our robin in the middle of that. And he'll attach himself nicely there. Then I'm going to run round various points. So I'm going to put some on this wall here. You just want to drip your icing, sort of pipe it on, make it look like it's dripping all over the place. So you've got lots of snow. We're just going to pipe some of it around. There's no sort of right or wrong to this. It's just wherever you like, where you think looks good. I like a bit sort of at the bottom of Santa's feet, I think. Maybe a little bit around the bottom of our cards. And it's always really nice to put some sort of coming from the post box underneath. I normally just have a little bit along this edge here. Like that. A bit up here. Now I've made my royal icing quite soft so that it does start to spread and it sort of smooths itself out. If it's a bit thick, it will sort of stay a bit lumpy. You want it to kind of be quite smooth. Just going to turn that round a second. So I can pop a bit on this wall here. Some around the sherry bottle. Let's put a bit more on my post box. There we go. Maybe a little bit over here just for filling up the space. Lovely. Now once you're happy with all where you've put your icing, what I'm going to do is I've got some of these little tiny white pearl dragees here, which I'm just going to put in my hand, and I'm just going to sprinkle that on top of some of the patches of snow, just to add texture. Make sure you've got lots of those on there. Wonderful. Okay, and that's your festive Santa and postbox scene done.